As we cover the Israel-Hamas war, the hostage situation continues to be one of the biggest issues. Haim gets you all the details of what is happening currently.
Thank you so much, Shivan. Now, in the early hours of the 7th of October, Israelis living near the border with Gaza woke up to the sounds of Hamas militants killing and kidnapping their neighbors. As the hours stretched on, Israelis hid. They were terrified. They wondered if they would even live through the nightmare. More than a month after the Hamas attack on Israel, the hostage situation remains grim to say the least. Here's a closer look at the US, Qatar and Egypt's efforts to broker a deal with Hamas for the release of the hostages. Well, according to reports and sources, Qatar is brokering a deal to free 10 to 15 hostages by Hamas militants. The deal will happen in exchange for 1 or 2 days of humanitarian pause in Gaza. The negotiations between the two are being coordinated with the United States of America. According to sources, in the proposed deal, 6 American hostages are likely to be released as well. So far, Hamas has released 4 hostages. This was on the 20th of October. An American-Israeli mother and daughter duo were released. 3 days later, 2 elderly Israeli women were freed by the militant group, raising hopes about the effectiveness of hostage negotiations. But it's been over a month since the war broke out, when on the 7th of October, Hamas attacked Israel. They took with them some 240 people who are in fact being held hostage in Gaza. The hostages are from more than 40 countries, and they include people in all age groups, from a child to an elderly person. The loved ones of the hostages, they are awaiting their return. At times calmly, at times in tears, families are appealing to the world leaders to accomplish the mission of their life.
We will do anything it takes to bring them back home. We are willing to sign a contract with the devil if we need to. Right now, the only thing that we are interested in is to bring them back home.
My name is Michael Levy, and I'm Or Levy's brother. Or was kidnapped from the Nova Festival. He also lost his wife, Einav, who was murdered in the Nova Festival.
Those were their desperate pleas. We're willing to sign a contract with the devil. Now, listening to the ordeal of these relatives in Jerusalem, more than 200 beds were set up outside Jerusalem Mayor's office to call for their release. The beds, which symbolized those held captive, were put by about 100 activists and families from villages which were attacked by Hamas. While in front of Tel Aviv Square, tens of blindfolded teddy bears were placed holding pictures of children taken hostage by the Hamas militants. You can see these visuals. This display was dedicated to some 30 children as young as 9 months old. So that is where the hostage situation stands at the moment. Now, Qatar is currently brokering a deal to free about 10 to 15 hostages. This, it says, will be in exchange for 1 or 2 days of a humanitarian pause in Gaza. Now, to discuss the situation further, joining us now on World DNA, we have with us John Blaxland, Professor in Intelligence Studies and International Security at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA.
Thanks for having me on the program. Good to be with you.
Sir, as I mentioned, the hostage situation remains grim to say the least. Netanyahu had made it clear a few days ago that there will be no all-out ceasefire until all hostages are released. Now, if we talk about the efforts by Qatar and Egypt and the United States, do you think this will yield any concrete results?
So Qatar is very well placed to lead in negotiations. So if there is to be some success, that's probably where it's going to happen. So yes, I think that is reasonable. That is probable. We will see some progress there, but only incremental, because the hostages are key for Hamas for their plan. You know, they're using them as effectively as human shields, so they're not going to give them up lightly. And so I think this is going to be a very prolonged affair, I'm afraid.
Professor, Mr. Blaxland also wanted to take your opinion on this. Now, the Rafah crossing was opened for foreign nationals recently, and Hamas also stated that they do not need these hostages anymore. Now, this was a statement which has come out from their front. What do you why do you feel the hostage crisis still persists when Hamas doesn't need them and foreign nationals are already being allowed to leave from Rafah?
So what they say and what they do aren't necessarily the same thing. So we need to separate out the rhetoric from the reality. Mm-hmm. The bottom line is that there are still, many, many people who are held hostage. They may be willing to let some Americans go, but there are other Israelis who they will not be letting go anytime soon. Let's not forget the rhetoric from Hamas for a long time has been about the removal of Israel, the destruction of Israel. And Hamas has, for years now, been investing a large proportion of the goodwill from the rest of the world, not into beautifying and making, Gaza the Hong Kong of the Middle East, but into building tunnels and rockets. So when we hear the figures coming out of Hamas authorities about how many children have been killed, how many civilians have been injured and so on, we need to be very mindful that this is part of a propaganda campaign and that this is from the Hamas authorities that have committed almost all of their efforts into turning Gaza into a fortress, not into a city where people can live. It is also reasonable to say that the Hamas authorities have been blocking the exit of people. There are considerable and worrying reports of people who've been targeted for trying to escape. Of course, the other thing to remember, there's a couple of other points worth noting. We talk about the occupied territories. Gaza was not occupied. It hasn't been occupied since 2005. So, we talk about the occupied West Bank. Okay, well, it's not the Palestinian Authority that's risen up to conduct the sabotage of the terrorist activities on October the 7th. That was from self-administered Gaza, not occupied Gaza. I think there's another point here worth noting. We don't hear much about Egypt in this equation. And let's not forget, until 1967, the Gaza Strip was actually part of Egypt. Now, the Israelis captured it in the war of 1967, and in the subsequent negotiations that between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat that were overseen by Jimmy Carter in the mid-1970s, they left Gaza separate from the rest of Egypt. So when we talk about what the options are, there's a big elephant in the room here, and that is the question of what is Egypt doing to help alleviate the problems? What can we expect of Egypt to do to perhaps offer a way out of this impasse? Now, war is an extension of politics by other means, so the politics of it has to be clear. So. And unfortunately, that's not clear at the moment.
All right. Now, once again, I want to bring your focus back to the tactical pauses, just for better understanding here, sir. These tactical pauses, do you think, as I mentioned earlier, an all-out humanitarian ceasefire is not in the picture at the moment? Do you think there's any guarantee a tactical pause will help the hostage crisis in any way?
So the tactical pause, depending on what that might look like, clearly the concern from the Israelis' point of view will be that this will be capitalised upon by Hamas to reinforce their positions, to reposition troops and ammunition and weapons, and to use it to undermine the advances that the Israelis have undertaken so far. So, this is a devilishly difficult situation. Israel feels compelled to act to press on, mindful that there is enormous potential backlash, and the Palestinians in Gaza in particular have been masterful at soliciting a response from Palestinian supporters around the world, which makes it very difficult for Israel to act with impunity and to act with freedom of action, knowing that its support base in the United States and in other countries, including in Australia, where there's been major protests by migrant groups in Australia, particularly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. This restricts the freedom of action of countries to support Israel, and that makes it very difficult for Israel to decide to, go slow, go fast, allow for a pause or not.
It is definitely a very, very difficult situation, and we are seeing that happen. It's already been a month and the hostages are still very much there with Hamas, but here's hoping that a solution is found soon. Thank you so much for joining in on the broadcaster. That was Professor John Blaxland joining us from Sydney.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on the program.